Welcome to the deep dive. We are taking a stack of historical records, legal briefs, wartime archives, and, we're really going to extract the most important insights for you today.
Yeah, and we have a truly fascinating topic today.
We really do. Because in 1944, a welder working on a California mudflat actually managed to defeat one of the most powerful labor unions in America.
Right, which is just an incredible feat.
It is. And in doing so, he basically rewrote civil rights law a full 20 years before Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington.
Yeah, a full 2 decades early.
Exactly. But the craziest part about this whole story is that he didn't do it by fighting his boss.
No, he didn't.
He did it by fighting the very union that was, supposed to protect him.
It's a remarkable piece of history. I mean, it really is, because to understand how a welder achieved something that monumental, we have to look at the incredibly unique, high-pressure environment that made it possible.
Right.
We really have to look at where he was standing at the time.
So let's set the scene for you. I want you to visualize a completely empty stretch of land in the early days of 1942.
Just nothing there.
Yeah, literally nothing. You are standing on the edge of Sausalito, California. It's just a bit north of San Francisco.
Right across the Golden Gate.
Exactly. And it's cold, the fog is rolling in off the bay, and what you're looking at is essentially just a giant, sleepy mudflat.
Yeah.
A marshy expanse where the water meets the shore, just, birds, marsh grass, and mud.
Mud as far as you can see.
Right. But fast forward just a matter of months, that quiet marshland is completely obliterated.
It's just gone.
Gone. And it's replaced by this roaring, massive industrial engine known as Marinship.
Yeah, Marinship.
You have roughly 20,000 people working on this exact spot.
Mm.
And they're working around the clock building massive cargo ships for a country that is just desperate to fight World War II.
The scale of that transformation, it's just hard to wrap your head around.
It really is.
I mean, they took a piece of untouched nature and turned it into one of the most vital logistical hubs on the planet. And they did it essentially overnight.
And that speed, right, that absolute desperation for wartime production, it created a massive contradiction.
A huge one.
And that contradiction is really our mission for this deep dive. Because Marinship was, at the same time, one of the most genuinely and effectively integrated workplaces of the entire war.
Right.
A place where black and white Americans worked shoulder to shoulder. But at the exact same time, it was a site of deeply entrenched, formalized racial segregation.
It's a fascinating duality, honestly.
Yeah.
You couldn't walk onto the property without experiencing both of those realities.
I've been thinking about it kind of like a building with two distinct doors.
Okay, I like that.
Right, so imagine you arrive at Marinship looking for work. The first door you encounter is the door to the shipyard floor itself. And that door is thrown wide open. It is offering unprecedented economic opportunity to people who had been, deliberately locked out of American industry for generations.
Absolutely wide open.
But to keep that job, you had to walk through a second door.
Yeah, the Union Hall.
Exactly, the door to the Union Hall. And that door is held firmly, legally shut, strictly enforcing a second-class status based entirely on race.
That tension between the open door of the factory and the closed door of the union, that is exactly what fueled the uprising.
So how did these two opposing forces collide on a single waterfront? That's what we want to figure out.
Yeah, it's a huge collision.
We're going to explore how that collision led to a massive worker strike, a landmark California Supreme Court case called James v. Marinship Corps, and a profound civil rights victory.
Right.
But before we get to the courtroom, I am really trying to understand the physical reality of this place.
Yeah, it's hard to picture.
Like, if you are the U.S. Maritime Commission in 1942 and you urgently need ships to fight a two-front war, how do you just conjure a massive shipyard out of a swamp?
Well, you do it by fundamentally changing how ships are built and who is allowed to build them.
Okay.
So in early 1942, the government tapped the WWII Bechtel company to construct this emergency shipyard.
Right, the Bechtel Corporation.
Exactly. And the mandate was speed above all else. I mean, they needed cargo ships yesterday.
Yeah, the war was already raging.
Right. So between 1942 and 1945, Marinship built and launched roughly 93 vessels.
Wow.
And the records show this included 15 Liberty ships, which were, the primary cargo workhorses of the war, and 78 T2 tankers.
The tankers were for fuel, right?
Yeah, they were crucial for moving aviation fuel across the Pacific.
Wait, let me just slow you down there. 93 massive steel ships in roughly 3 years.
Yeah, about that.
From a facility that literally didn't even exist. How is that mechanically possible? I know we talked about the Kaiser shipyards across the bay in Richmond doing similar things, but the logistics of this just blow my mind.
It is mind-blowing, but it's all about the transition from riveting to welding.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
This is a crucial mechanical shift. So before the war, ships were primarily riveted together.
Right.
And riveting is a highly skilled, highly specialized trade.
It takes a lot of training.
Exactly. It requires teams of people, heaters, catchers, drivers, and it takes years of apprenticeship to master.
Wow.
But there simply weren't enough master riveters in America to build the fleet that Roosevelt needed.
So they changed the technology to fit the labor pool.
That's exactly what they did. They leaned heavily into welding and prefabrication.
Oh, interesting.
Because welding can be taught to an unskilled laborer in a matter of weeks.
Really? Just weeks?
Yeah. You can take someone who has spent their entire life as a sharecropper in the rural South, put a welding torch in their hand, run them through an intensive training course, and within a month, they are a productive part of the assembly line.
That is incredible.
And they aren't building a whole ship, right? They are welding one specific seam on one specific prefabricated steel block over and over again.
Oh, I see. That makes total sense. It's basically the Henry Ford assembly line model, but applied to 3,000-ton steel vessels.
Exactly.
But, that solves the technology problem. It doesn't solve the human problem.
No, not at all.
Because if you build a massive factory that requires 20,000 workers in a place that used to be a swamp, where do all those people live? I mean, Sausalito in 1942 wasn't exactly a booming metropolis.
No, it was a tiny community. There definitely were not 20,000 unemployed workers just sitting around Marin County waiting for a job.
Right.
The labor shortage was so severe that the shipyard had to recruit nationwide.
Literally pulling people from everywhere.
Yeah, pulling migrant workers from all over the country. And to house them, the federal government had to step in and do something completely unprecedented.
Which was?
They built an entire town from scratch. It was called Marin City.
Marin City. Okay, I am having a hard time visualizing the reality of a pop-up town. Are we talking about just a bunch of army tents in the mud?
No, it was a fully functional, albeit rapidly constructed municipality.
Okay.
The government threw up rows and rows of barracks and dormitory-style housing.
Wow.
But they also built brand new schools, a church, commercial infrastructure, roads, plumbing.
Like a real town?
Yeah. All of it built almost instantly to accommodate this massive, sudden influx of strangers.
See, how does that actually work on a social level? You can't just drop thousands of random people into a box and expect a functioning society, right?
It's incredibly chaotic.
Think about it for a second. If you're listening to this, I want you to imagine packing up your life in the Deep South or, the rural Midwest.
Just packing whatever you can carry.
Exactly. You take a crowded train for days, you arrive in California, a place you've never been, and the federal government just hands you keys to a war housing unit.
Right.
And your neighbor on the left is a white farmer from Oklahoma. Your neighbor on the right is a black laborer from Louisiana.
Yeah.
You're all complete strangers, thrown into incredibly close quarters, sharing resources in this muddy, chaotic construction zone.
It was a demographic earthquake.
That's a great way to put it.
Because peacetime America in the 1930s and early 40s was highly stratified. It was geographically, economically, and racially segregated.
Very much so.
And suddenly, the war effort just takes a giant scoop of the American population, mixes it all together, and pours it onto this one hillside overlooking a shipyard.
Which fundamentally rewrites the social rules, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you are managing this project, you can't afford to care about the social customs of the 1930s. You just need bodies on the assembly line.
That is precisely what happened. The sheer desperation for wartime production forced the federal government to orchestrate an artificial society on the fly.
Wow.
And this physical proximity, this unprecedented gathering of people, leads directly to what happened on the job floor itself.
Okay, let's walk through that first door we talked about, the door that was thrown wide open.
Right.
Because the historical sources are very clear. The Marinship earned a reputation as one of the most genuinely integrated workforces of any wartime emergency shipyard in the country.
Yes, and to understand why, we have to look at the federal pressure that forced that door open in the first place.
Okay.
In 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802.
And what did that do?
It explicitly barred discrimination in defense work.
Let's stop you there for a second. Because Roosevelt didn't just wake up one morning with a sudden moral revelation about civil rights, did he?
No, definitely not.
What actually forced his hand to issue that specific order?
You're entirely right to question the motive there. The executive order was the result of immense calculated political pressure.
From who?
A prominent black labor leader named A. Philip Randolph.
Okay.
He had threatened to organize a massive march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in the defense industry and in the military.
Oh, wow.
And in 1941, the prospect of 100,000 black Americans marching in the Capitol during a national security crisis that terrified the Roosevelt administration.
I can imagine.
So Roosevelt issued the executive order essentially to call off the march.
Okay, so it was a concession extracted through massive leverage.
Yes.
But an order on paper in Washington is one thing. Enforcing it on a muddy shipyard in California is a completely different thing.
True, but when you combine that federal mandate with an absolute desperate labor shortage, the old peacetime barriers just had to give way.
They didn't have a choice.
Exactly. For black workers, particularly black men and women migrating from the South as part of the Great Migration, this was a watershed moment.
Yeah. Because these were high-paying, skilled industrial jobs.
Right.
Jobs that had been systematically, deliberately denied to black Americans in peacetime manufacturing.
Exactly. Before the war, industrial jobs of this caliber, jobs that actually offered a pathway to the middle class, were largely walled off.
Yeah.
The Great Migration was already underway, with people fleeing the terror of the Jim Crow South, but the war production boom really accelerated it.
Put them west.
Yeah. These workers arrived at Marinship, and because Bechtel needed ships so badly, they were hired, trained, and put right on the line.
I really want to emphasize what a shock to the system this must have been.
Oh, completely.
If you grew up in a system deliberately designed to legally enforce your subservience in every single aspect of daily life,
Yeah.
and then you step onto this booming, chaotic, futuristic shipyard floor.
It must have felt like another planet.
Right. You are handed a welding torch, and you are standing side by side with white workers, piecing together the exact same steel hull.
Exactly.
Because the steel doesn't care who's holding the torch.
The shared mission of wartime production created this very unique equalizer on the factory floor.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of work demanded that anyone who could learn the trade had to be put to work immediately.
No time for prejudice.
Right. You had a workforce that actually looked like a true cross-section of the American public, engaging in the exact same labor, facing the exact same physical dangers of the shipyard.
I can see why it's so tempting to look back at that and frame it as this, beautiful, patriotic utopia.
Yeah, the classic wartime propaganda reel.
Exactly. Everyone pulling together for the war effort. But I have to push back here.
Go ahead.
Systems of power and deep-seated prejudices don't just magically vanish because A. Philip Randolph forced the president to sign a piece of paper.
No, they don't.
Or just because there's a labor shortage, people don't just change overnight.
They absolutely do not.
Oh.
And that is where the illusion of the wartime utopia really shatters against the reality of bureaucratic mechanics.
Right.
While the employer, Bechtel, and the federal government integrated the work itself, the gateway to keeping that work was controlled by a completely different entity.
Right. The second door, the union hall.
Exactly. To understand how a worker could be treated as an equal on the floor but a second-class citizen in reality, you have to understand the labor mechanics of the time.
Okay, break it down for us.
Marinship operated under what is called a closed shop contract.
Okay, let's look at this mechanically, because closed shop sounds like a very dry labor term, but it is actually the entire engine of this conflict.
It is the whole ballgame.
Let me try an analogy here. It's like a modern software monopoly. Think of Apple controlling the App Store.
Okay, I'm following.
Bechtel, the employer, is the iPhone. They want all the apps they can get. They want the labor.
Right.
But the union is the App Store. The union controls the platform. Bechtel wants your labor, but if the union won't approve your developer account, if they won't grant you membership, you cannot get on the phone. You cannot work.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it.
It's a total bottleneck.
Yes. A closed shop agreement is a legally binding contract between the employer and a labor union.
Okay.
It stipulates that union membership is a mandatory condition of employment. The employer essentially outsources the hiring gateway to the union hall.
Wow.
So if you do not belong to the union, you cannot be hired. And if you lose your union membership, the employer is legally obligated to fire you.
So the union holds the absolute keys to your survival.
They do.
And at Marinship, The union holding those keys was the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers, specifically Local 6.
Yes, Local 6. And they had an explicit rule in their constitution. They barred black workers from full membership.
Period.
Period.
Let's dig into the why of that for a second, because we know the obvious answer is deep-seated racism. But was there an underlying economic mechanism driving this specific policy?
Yes, there was.
Because unions are supposed to be about worker solidarity. Why write a constitutional rule that so clearly fractures that solidarity?
Well, to understand the Boilermakers' position, and we are examining this historically, of course, not endorsing it.
Right. Just reporting what the sources say.
Exactly. You have to look at the trauma of the Great Depression.
Oh, okay.
Throughout the 1930s, tradesmen like Boilermakers, plumbers, and electricians practically starved. There was just no work.
Right.
So when unions finally gained real power and closed shop contracts under the New Deal, their primary instinct was extreme protectionism.
They wanted to guard what little they had.
Yes, they wanted to artificially limit the labor pool to ensure their existing members always had high wages and steady work.
So they basically weaponized race as a tool for economic monopoly.
Precisely. By categorically excluding an entire demographic, they artificially restricted the supply of labor.
Which increases the value of their white members' labor.
Exactly. They viewed the massive influx of black migrant workers not as fellow laborers to be organized, but as a direct threat to the economic security they had just scraped back after the Depression.
But this creates an impossible knot at Marinship.
It really does.
Think about it. Bechtel is thrilled to hire black workers. The federal government says it's illegal to discriminate in defense work.
Right.
But the union says black workers cannot join. And the contract says if you can't join, you can't work.
It's a complete paradox.
How did they resolve this so that ships could actually get built?
Well, the union solution was a bureaucratic contortion. They created what they called an auxiliary.
An auxiliary.
Yeah. They forced black workers into a completely segregated subordinate unit known as Local A41.
Wait, an auxiliary, does that mean it was like a stepping stone into the main union, like an apprenticeship or a probationary period?
No, that is exactly the trap. It was not a pathway to full membership. It was a permanent holding pen.
Oh, wow.
Let's look really closely at the mechanical conditions of this auxiliary A41.
Okay.
Black workers were required to pay the exact same union dues and initiation fees as the white workers in Local 6.
You're kidding.
No. And that money came directly out of their paychecks.
So they are paying full price. What did they get in return? Virtually nothing.
Nothing.
The auxiliary was controlled entirely by the white leadership of Local 6. The black workers had no real voice in union affairs. They could not vote on leadership or contracts.
So taxation without representation.
Exactly. They had no equal protection in grievance processes. If a white foreman treated them unfairly, the union would not defend them.
Unbelievable.
And as I mentioned, there was absolutely no path for them to be promoted or accepted into the regular union.
Going back to the App Store analogy, it's like being forced to pay the 30% developer fee to Apple, but you weren't actually allowed to publish your app.
Right.
You get no customer support, and you aren't even allowed in the building. You are just paying the fee because they say you have to.
And if you refuse to pay the fee, the union revokes your good standing, and they invoke the closed shop contract to force Bechtel to fire you.
It is a staggering psychological toll.
It really is.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a black worker at Marinship. You've answered the call of your country. You are doing back-breaking, dangerous work. You are inhaling fumes, risking your life around heavy machinery every single day.
Grueling work.
And you feel the immense pride of watching a massive tanker slide into the bay knowing your own hands built it.
Right.
You are treated as an equal component in the machinery of war. But every single week, you have to walk to a window and hand a portion of your hard-earned wages to an organization that explicitly states you are inferior and unwelcome.
It was an institutionalized indignity.
That's exactly what it was.
And the Boilermakers' stated defense during the war was highly bureaucratic. They argued that under their existing internal constitutional rules, they simply couldn't admit black workers.
Right.
They framed the auxiliary as an administrative accommodation, a way to allow these men and women to work the closed shop yard without the union having to rewrite its own internal bylaws.
That is just bureaucratic cover for extortion.
Yeah.
They wanted the dues money, they needed the labor to fulfill the government contracts, but he refused to yield an inch of actual power or equality.
Yes.
But You have highly motivated, highly skilled workers who have just migrated across the entire country to seize a better life.
Right.
They know their own worth. A system like that is just a pressure cooker. How long did the union really think these workers were just going to quietly hand over their paychecks?
Not very long. Which brings us to the inevitable breaking point. By late 1943, the pressure cooker exploded.
Okay, so how does an explosion like that actually happen? Because you're in a federal war town, it's 1943, the country is in the middle of a massive global conflict.
Yeah, stakes are incredibly high.
You can't just casually organize a strike. Isn't halting war production considered treason, or at the very least draft dodging?
It was highly risky.
How do you organize hundreds of marginalized workers without getting immediately crushed by the military or the police?
It requires extraordinary leadership, meticulous organizing, and immense personal courage. And this is where we have to introduce Joseph James.
I really want to spend some time on Joseph James, because his background is just fascinating. He wasn't just a random guy who got angry one afternoon.
No, Joseph James was uniquely positioned for this moment.
Okay.
By day, he was a skilled welder on the line at Marinship. He knew the heat, the sparks, the exhaustion of the floor.
He lived it.
Yeah, he had the respect of his fellow workers because he was doing the exact same brutal labor they were.
Right.
But outside of the shipyard, he was a trained baritone singer, he was highly educated, and crucially, he was a prominent leader in the local chapter of the NAACP in San Francisco.
See, that dual identity is everything.
It really is.
He is the physical bridge between the mudflat and the courtroom. He understands the raw reality of labor, but he also understands the intellectual, legal machinery of civil rights organizing.
Exactly. When James looked at the auxiliary system, he didn't just see an unfair workplace rule. He saw a fundamental constitutional violation of the right to work and the right to equal representation.
Wow.
And he knew exactly how to build a coalition.
So what did he do?
Throughout 1943, he and other local leaders began organizing the workers in Marin City. They held secret meetings, they circulated information, and they built a consensus that the current situation was just intolerable.
I'm picturing the sheer exhaustion of that. You work a grueling shift welding steel, and then you spend your night walking through the muddy barracks of Marin City.
Yeah, knocking on doors.
Convincing terrified workers to risk absolutely everything they have to stand up to the union.
And the risk cannot be overstated here.
Right.
We talked about Marin City being a federal pop-up town. Housing was explicitly tied to employment.
Oh, wow.
If you get fired for striking, you don't just lose your paycheck, you lose your family's barracks.
You are instantly homeless.
Yes, you are suddenly homeless, potentially stranded in a new state, thousands of miles from your roots.
And wartime draft rules applied too, right?
Exactly, with the wartime draft hanging over your head if you aren't employed in a vital defense industry.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
So what was the actual mechanism of the strike? How did they execute it?
It was a highly coordinated act of financial defiance.
Okay.
In November 1943, more than 200 black workers at Marinship, led by James, simply refused to pay their dues to the segregated auxiliary A41.
They just stopped paying.
Right. They didn't walk off the job or sabotage the ships. They just stopped paying the toll.
They essentially called the union's bluff.
Yes.
They're saying, we will build the ships, but we will not finance our own segregation. What are you going to do about it?
And the union's response was swift and merciless.
Well, what did they do?
Local 6 immediately declared that these 200 workers were no longer in good standing. They took that list of names to Bechtel management and demanded their termination under the closed shop contract.
Okay, let's stop and look at Bechtel and the government for a second.
Yeah.
You have 200 essential, fully trained wartime workers. The country is literally begging for ships. Did Bechtel just wash their hands of it and say, sorry, contract is a contract? Were they totally bound by the law, or were they complicit?
Well, on paper, Marinship management argued their hands were tied.
Right.
Under federal labor law at the time, a closed shop contract was legally binding. If the employer refused to fire workers who had lost their union standing, the employer was in breach of contract.
And what happens then?
They could face a massive strike from the white union members, which would halt all ship production entirely.
So they chose the path of least resistance.
Yes, they did. But by blindly enforcing a contract they knew was fundamentally discriminatory, management became the physical mechanism of the exclusion.
You pulled the trigger.
Exactly. They prioritized the stability of their union contract over the civil rights of their black employees. They fired all 200 workers.
Unbelievable.
They walked them out of the very yard they had helped build.
It's an incredible standoff. But Joseph James didn't just walk away quietly and look for another job, did he?
No, absolutely not.
He leveraged his NAACP connections.
Hmm.
How does a local firing on a Sausalito mudflat catch the attention of the national civil rights movement?
Because the national NAACP recognized the terrifying precedent this could set.
Explain that.
If a union could legally run a monopoly on jobs through a closed shop while simultaneously explicitly enforcing racial segregation within that monopoly, then the economic future for Black Americans across the entire country would be permanently crippled.
Right, because war or no war, if this system stands, it means Black workers will never be allowed to fully participate in the American middle class.
Exactly. Because the unions will always gatekeep the best jobs.
So the NAACP saw this as a huge opportunity.
Yes. The NAACP saw this as the perfect test case to strike at the heart of discriminatory labor practices.
Okay.
And this leads to the courtroom battle that changed everything, James v. Marinship Court in 1944.
So Joseph James becomes the named plaintiff in a massive coordinated lawsuit backed by the full weight of the NAACP.
He does.
They are seeking an injunction against the union and Marinship to stop the firings and dismantle the discriminatory closed shop enforcement. And they bring in heavy legal firepower.
They did. The legal team included a young NAACP attorney whose name, if you know American history, is instantly recognizable.
Who was it?
Thurgood Marshall.
Wow. Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah.
A full decade before he would famously argue Brown v. Board of Education before the U.S. Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall is involved in formulating the arguments for these welders in California.
Yes, he is. But it is vital to emphasize here that the local organizing was the bedrock of this case.
Right. We can't lose sight of the workers.
Exactly. Joseph James and the local NAACP leaders lived it, they brought it forward, they risked their livelihoods.
Yeah.
Marshall's presence lent incredible legal firepower and national strategy, but this was absolutely a worker-led rebellion from the ground up.
Let's get into the actual legal dogfight.
Mm-hmm.
What was Marshall and the NAACP's specific legal mechanism here?
Okay.
Because they couldn't just walk into court and say, racism is bad, please make them stop. They needed a precise legal doctrine to invalidate the firings.
The legal argument they constructed was brilliant, and it centered on the concept of monopoly power.
Okay.
The argument was this. A union that makes membership the mandatory price of a job cannot subsequently set a racial price on its membership.
Let me make sure I understand the nuance there. Are they arguing against the concept of a closed shop entirely?
No, and that is the real genius of it. They didn't try to destroy the union's right to exist or even its right to hold a closed shop.
Interesting.
They argued that if a union wields the absolute power of a closed shop, literally holding a monopoly over a person's survival in a given industry, it ceases to be a mere private club.
Ah, I see. If it's just a private social club, they can invite whoever they want.
Right.
But if they control the only gateway to employment, they take on what essentially amounts to government power.
Precisely. It is the concept of quasi-governmental power.
Quasi-governmental power.
Yeah. The NAACP argued that because the union held this massive life-or-death economic power, it had to be bound by the same constitutional rules and public policies as a government entity.
Wow.
It could not wield that monopoly arbitrarily or in a discriminatory manner. You cannot look at the color of a person's skin and say, you can't have a key, but you still have to pay the locksmith.
That is a massive philosophical takeaway.
It really is.
When a private entity gains a monopoly over human survival, it must be regulated like a public utility. That applies as much today to tech monopolies and digital platforms as it did to labor unions in 1944.
That's a great point.
So they take this argument all the way to the California Supreme Court. What happens?
In late 1944, under Chief Justice Phil S. Gibson, the court issued its landmark ruling. The California Supreme Court ruled entirely in favor of Joseph James and the Black workers.
Wow. What was Chief Justice Gibson's exact reasoning? Did he adopt the NAACP's argument?
He did. Chief Justice Gibson wrote a sweeping opinion dissecting the nature of union power.
Okay.
The court ruled that excluding Black workers from equal membership and forcing them into a powerless auxiliary was contrary to the public policy of California.
So what was the tangible result for the actual workers?
The court declared that the closed shop provision could not be legally enforced against these specific men.
Right.
Marinship was ordered to immediately stop firing workers who refused to pay dues to the discriminatory auxiliary.
So the union lost.
Well, the union could keep its closed shop, but only if it admitted Black workers on equal terms. If they maintained the segregated auxiliary, they forfeited the right to enforce the closed shop.
It's a brilliant legal checkmate. You can be racists or you can have a monopoly, but you cannot have both.
Exactly.
I want to clarify the scope of this for you, the listener.
Right.
Because it's easy to look at a Supreme Court ruling and assume it fixed everything everywhere overnight.
Right. That's important to clarify.
This was the California Supreme Court.
Yeah.
This was a state decision, not a national federal law. It didn't magically integrate every union in the country.
That is a crucial distinction. In terms of immediate jurisdiction, it was a localized victory. It bound this specific shipyard and this specific union local in California.
Okay.
But legally and symbolically, it was an earthquake. It proved that the armor of segregation and organized labor could be pierced.
Yeah.
It established a legal framework, this idea of quasi-governmental power that other state courts and eventually federal legislators would use to dismantle discriminatory practices.
I really want you to stop and recognize the timeline we are talking about here.
Yeah, the timeline is wild.
This legal victory occurred in 1944. World War II is still raging. Segregation is strictly enforced by law in much of the country. The military itself is still completely segregated.
Right.
This foundational blow against union racial discrimination happened an astonishing 20 years before the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964.
It is a profound testament to the power of workers organizing. A welder, a man working with his hands on a muddy waterfront, forced the state's highest legal minds to reconcile the stated democratic ideals of America with the ugly reality of its labor practices.
He really did.
Joseph James wedged the door open and he forced the law to walk through it.
He and the 200 workers won their right to work without paying for their own subjugation. The yard kept building ships.
Right.
But this leads to a completely different and somewhat darker mystery. The workers won the legal battle. But what happens when the war ends? What happens when the shipyard simply vanishes?
That brings us to the post-war legacy of Marin City and the bitter irony of what happened next.
So in August 1945, the Axis powers surrender. World War II ends.
Yeah.
And almost instantly, the desperate purpose of Marinship evaporates. The U.S. Maritime Commission no longer needs dozens of massive cargo ships a month.
They don't need them at all.
So just as quickly as the yard was thrown up in 1942, it is rapidly decommissioned and physically dismantled.
To take it apart.
The cranes come down, the welding torches go cold, the steel plates are hauled away. The roaring engine goes completely quiet. It literally goes back to being a mudflat.
But the people didn't vanish with the ships.
Right.
The shipyard was dismantled, but Marin City, the sprawling federal war housing town, built across the highway that remained.
Wow.
You have thousands of workers who migrated from across the country who have put down roots, whose children are in local schools. They are looking to transition to peacetime life.
So they won the legal battle for equal employment, and they are living in this integrated pop-up town. On paper, it sounds like the perfect foundation for a thriving, diverse post-war community.
It does sound like that.
But I'm looking at the demographic maps of Marin City from the 1950s and 60s, and it is almost entirely segregated.
Yes, it is.
It became a predominantly black community surrounded by a very affluent, predominantly white county. If they won the legal battle, how did they lose the neighborhood?
Because the battlefield shifted.
What do you mean?
During the war, the absolute necessity of production forced integration. But as soon as the emergency wartime housing rules lapsed and people began looking for permanent homes in the broader San Francisco Bay Area, a very dark, very systematic peacetime machinery kicked in.
We were talking about the bureaucracy of real estate, redlining and restrictive covenants.
Exactly. When the shipyard closed, white workers leaving Marin City had a multitude of options.
Right.
They could utilize their GI Bill benefits and secure conventional mortgages to buy homes in the rapidly expanding new post-war suburbs springing up across Marin County and the broader Bay Area.
But black workers, many of whom had served in the military and had the exact same GI Bill benefits on paper, faced a completely different reality when they walked into a bank.
Night and day difference.
Let's explain the actual mechanics of redlining, because it's crucial to understand how this isolation happened. It wasn't just individual prejudiced real estate agents, it was a federal system.
You're right, it was deeply systematic. Redlining stems from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC.
Okay, what was that?
It was a federal agency created during the New Deal. They created maps of every major American city to assess the risk of mortgage lending.
Assessing risk, right.
Appraisers literally took red ink and drew lines around neighborhoods that had even a small population of black residents.
No.
They graded these redlined areas as hazardous for investment.
So if you are a black family from Marin City and you find a nice house in a new suburb a few miles away, you go to the bank to get a mortgage.
Right.
The bank looks at the federal maps, sees that your presence in that new neighborhood would downgrade its rating, and they outright deny your loan.
Exactly. The federal government fundamentally refused to back mortgages for Black families moving into white neighborhoods.
And if the federal government wouldn't insure the loan, the banks wouldn't write the mortgage.
Nope. They wouldn't touch it.
But what if a Black family had the cash to buy a home outright? What was stopping them then?
That is where restrictive covenants came in.
Restrictive covenants.
Yeah. These were explicit, legally binding clauses written directly into the property deeds of millions of American homes.
Written right into the deed.
Yes. A typical covenant would state, in plain legal English, that the property could never be sold or rented to anyone of African, Asian, or Hispanic descent.
And these weren't just informal neighborhood agreements.
No, not at all.
These were enforceable in a court of law. If a white homeowner tried to sell their house to a Black family, their white neighbors could literally sue them to stop the sale.
Precisely. So you have a two-pronged systemic attack. Redlining denied Black families the capital to buy homes, and restrictive covenants made it illegal for them to buy homes in most neighborhoods, even if they had the capital.
So what happens to the Black families who migrated to work at Marinship? The ones who risked everything to strike? The ones who helped win a massive civil rights case at the California Supreme Court?
They found themselves completely boxed in.
Boxed in.
Deliberately steered away from every other neighborhood in the county, they were essentially contained in Marin City.
Wow.
The federal government eventually transitioned the temporary war housing into permanent public housing.
Right.
Marin City transformed from a bustling, integrated, wartime boomtown into an isolated, segregated island of public housing within one of the wealthiest, whitest counties in the United States.
It is a bitter, profound irony. The federal government built Marin City specifically to bring everyone together for the sake of the war.
Yeah.
They built a temporary container for labor. But after the war, discriminatory banking and real estate laws sealed the lid on that container, trapping the Black population inside it.
It is a perfect example of how geography can become destiny.
Definitely.
The heavy machinery of the shipyard was pulled away, but the physical footprint, it left the housing, the concentrated population that hardened to something permanent.
Yeah.
The town outlived the economic boom that created it, carrying the demographic changes of the 1940s deep into the post-war decades.
Let's do a quick timeline recap for you, the listener, just to crystallize the incredible speed of this history, because it all happens in a flash.
It really does.
In 1942, a shipyard is built out of a swamp, and an entire town is erected overnight.
Right.
In 1943, the tension over the segregated union snaps, and 200 workers strike and are fired.
Yes.
In 1944, they take their fight to the state Supreme Court and win a landmark civil rights victory.
A massive victory.
And by 1945, the war ends, the yard is gone, but the people remain, soon to be trapped by redlining.
Just 4 years.
4 years. Just 4 years changed the trajectory of civil rights law and permanently altered the local geography.
It is a remarkably compressed period of history. It highlights how quickly massive social structures can be upended by necessity, and how quickly new structures, sometimes just as oppressive but hidden in different mechanisms, can be established in their wake.
So as we pull all of this together, what is the ultimate takeaway from this deep dive? For me, Marinship represents the entire World War II civil rights struggle compressed onto a single, muddy waterfront.
I agree completely.
You have the Great Migration, the industrial boom of the war, the legal fight against entrenched Jim Crow policies, and the post-war suburban housing crisis, all playing out in one tiny corner of California.
And the most important synthesis to draw from these sources is that the resolution to this conflict did not come from the benevolence of the institutions in charge.
Not at all.
The employer, Bechtel, was perfectly content to fire these men to keep the peace. The federal government stood by while it happened. And the Boilermakers Union fought to the bitter end to maintain their racial monopoly.
The resolution only came because Black workers, led by Joseph James, actively pried the door open.
Yes.
They didn't wait for permission or for a slow evolution of morals. They understood the mechanics of the system that was oppressing them, and they used the courts to force that system to break.
Exactly. They demanded that the state recognize their fundamental economic rights.
It is a brilliant example of marginalized people dissecting a bureaucratic trap, the closed shop, the auxiliary, and dismantling it through legal logic and collective action.
It really is.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we end this deep dive. We've talked about the concept of quasi-governmental power. In 1944, Joseph James and his fellow workers proved that you could defeat the blatant, visible segregation of a union hall in a court of law. They struck down the explicitly written rule that kept them out of the App Store, so to speak.
It won that fight.
But as the post-war fate of Marin City shows us, once those obvious visible barriers are struck down, discrimination has a terrifying way of just changing shape.
It evolved.
Exactly. It stops being a racist sign on a union hall door, and it starts hiding itself in the quiet, invisible lines of real estate maps,
Yeah.
in the algorithms of mortgage lenders, and in municipal zoning board meetings. It becomes bureaucratic, mechanical, and infinitely harder to fight.
That is the enduring, complex legacy of the Marinship story.
So here's the question you have to ask yourself as you look at the history beneath your own feet. What happens when the door you just bravely pried open leads directly to a neighborhood you aren't legally allowed to leave?
The fight shifted from the shipyard to the neighborhoods, from labor law to real estate law, but the underlying mechanisms of exclusion just adapted to the peacetime world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history around you and look closely at how the systems in your own life operate, because there is almost always a whole world hiding just beneath the surface of the mud.